Later, Angelica participates in her own match, and she absolutely destroys her opponent. Rick congratulates her on making it through the preliminaries, and Angelica brags about winning 40 matches in a row. Angelica also intends on winning her way through the block league, and Rick is eager to do his best. Angelica still can't believe that he's going to try and do 40 matches in 4 days, because each venue only hosts one bout per day. This means Rick will have to travel a long distance between preliminary matches, but Angelica doesn't think it's possible. Rick has to get to the Green Hill Arena in 10 minutes before his next fight, but Angelica gets annoyed because he isn't listening. This arena is 30 kilometers away, and he won't be able to get there in time, even if he rode in a carriage. Rick calls her crazy for even suggesting that he ride on a slow carriage, because he had rather just run. Angelica says that makes even less sense, but Rick shows that he is much faster than a carriage. Angelica would like to watch Rick's match, but there is no possible way she could make it in time. Rionette says she can make it happen, so she jumps over the builds to get there. At the venue we see that Rick already finished his match, but Angelica is in no shape to watch. Rick won, but he still needs to work on his 8 holdback technique, because he did too much damage. Rick heads to the next venue, so Angelica tries to avoid being dragged away again, but Rionette takes her away anyway. Then the 3 of them go from arena to arena, as Rick destroys several opponents. The 4 days pass, and Angelica is stunned, because Rick actually managed to win the 40 matches he needed for the preliminaries. Next is the block league matches, and Angelica is relieved that she is not in the same block as Rick. Angelica was hoping to win the entire tournament, but she realizes now that it will be impossible with Rick around. To make things worse, Rionette explains that the S-rank Brufston is participating as well. Angelica thinks that no matter how things seem, she still can't let a certain person get away with something. Rionette wonders what Angelica is talking about, but Angelica just changes the topic. Angelica wonders where Rick is, so Rionette explains that Rick is out on his daily 600 kilometers run. Angelica isn't even surprised anymore by the crazy stuff Rick does, and Angelica wonders how Rionette puts up with him. Rionette is always with Rick, so Angelica pities her, for people probably thinking that they are in love. Surprisingly, Rionette doesn't mind, as Rionette reveals that she has a deep affection for Rick. Some guy approaches them, so Angelica thinks he is trying to flirt with them. Embarrassingly for her, the guy just needs their help with some work because he doesn't have enough staff. Rick finishes his run, and he is met by the chairman of the Western League's management committee. His name is Snape, and he is impressed by Rick for being the fastest qualifier in the preliminary league's history. The lizard man is told that Angelica isn't there, and Rick is surprised that he knows her. Then Snape is the one to be surprised when Rick can tell that he is a retired fighter, and Rick explains that he knew Snape was a fighter from their handshake. Snape reveals that he last fought 20 years ago, when he won a little competition. The roar of the crowd was rejuvenating, but Snape retired when he was just 23 years old. That competition ended up being the first and last time he won anything. Snape doesn't compete anymore, but his company has entered someone in this year's competition. As Snape leaves, he tells Rick to say hello to Angelica for him, but Snape also wants him to warn her not to get too excited. Afterwards, Melisha seems worried, and she reveals that Snape is from the Dragonaut Company. Snape makes himself appear like a gentleman, but there are rumors that he is connected to the underworld. Snape is the lead sponsor of this year's competition, and sponsors are given 1 slot for a competitor in the tournament. Just then Rick overhears some guys talking about this year's bunny girls. They fawn over a newcomer, and they call her a dark elf girl. Then we see the bunny girls they are talking about, Angelica and Rionette, who have agreed to help the guy from earlier. The job of the bunny girls is to build excitement for the tournament and to take bets. Rionette only agreed to do it because Angelica did, and Angelica says that she couldn't turn down someone asking for help with blood on their face. Some drunk guy makes all the bunny girls uncomfortable, but he pays the price when he tries to touch Angelica. Angelica gets really embarrassed when Rick arrives, and Angelica explains that she is helping someone. Rick is shocked at how great Rionette looks, and Angelica becomes furious because Rick didn't react the same way to her. Elsewhere, the old gym leader reads about how Brufston was amazingly able to pass the preliminaries in just 2 days. What's even more incredible is that every one of his matches was decided by a single knockout blow. His accomplishment is getting all the attention, but Kelvin also points out that Rick was able to make it through the Western League in just 4 days. Kelvin isn't scared at all, and is just excited for this year's tournament. A look back we see when the gym owner first met Kelvin. The owner was stunned to see that Kelvin had just finished destroying a group of guys, and he called him by his nickname, which was the Hungry Wolf of the Slums. Kelvin asked the old man to clean up his mess, but the old guy refused. He explained that he was there to scout Kelvin and bring him back to Heractopia. In Heractopia he would be able to obtain whatever he wanted by fighting and winning. That didn't seem very interesting to Kelvin, so the owner explained that there were a lot of strong fighters there. This sounded like much more fun to Kelvin, so Kelvin agreed to go. Kelvin has that same expression on his face now, and Kelvin explained that he hasn't been this excited in some time. Back with Rick, Angelica is still upset that Rick didn't look at her a certain way. Rick changes the topic and reveals that Snape was looking for her. Angelica is clearly surprised, but she denies knowing anyone by that name. The next day the block league competition to decide the tournament participants begins. Only one participant from each block can participate in the final tournament, so it will be really intense. Angelica faces off against a woman named Helen, but Rick can tell that Angelica doesn't seem like her usual self. Angelica is really tense, but she still manages to win. Rick is up next, and he uses one of his 8 holdback technique to defeat his opponent. Rionette is pleased to see that Rick is getting better at holding back, but Angelica thinks he is just as ridiculous as ever. Then the two take turns winning fights, until there are only 4 matches left. Rick wants to discuss tactics because they have to win every match, but Angelica says that she doesn't need it. Angelica faces off against her next opponent, and Rick is impressed to see her combining her physical techniques with magic. However, Rick can tell that there is something dangerous about her opponent. This guy breaks through her magic, and he manages to land a devastating punch. Rick is concerned that she takes some serious damage, and it is announced that Angelica has been defeated. Angelica fought hard to press her opponent, but the guy named Taylor destroyed her with a single blow. Angelica gets healed, but her pride is still injured. Rick says that she was impatient and stubborn while fighting, but this just gets her more upset. Rick keeps trying to tell her that she could have won if she was more focused, so he wonders if something is bothering her. Rick isn't even sure if he will be able to do anything, but he wants to try and help her. Rick's kind words get Angelica to give in, and she reveals that Snape is her fiancé. Angelica explains that a year ago, her parents passed away in an accident. Angelica and her siblings took on the responsibilities of the household, but they were inexperienced and fell into great financial difficulties. Their evil grandfather stepped in and made a deal with Snape. Snape promised to provide them with a large sum of money, but he demanded to be allowed to marry Angelica. Rick has a seriously delayed reaction to the news, and Angelica becomes furious by his lack of ability to process information. Angelica goes on to explain that while trying to stop their marriage, she discovered that Snape had become the main sponsor for the tournament. Angelica prepares to reveal what Snape's true intentions are, but they are interrupted by some commotion. They find that some dragon guy that Angelica is horrified of is causing a stir, and he is being confronted by the guy that easily defeated Angelica earlier. Taylor tries to stop the dragon man from hurting a woman, but the dragon man tells him that he is getting too cocky. Then Angelica is shocked when the beast knocks Taylor out with just one blow. A waitress tries to calm the monster down, but he just ends up bothering her as well. Angelica jumps in to stop him, but this just infuriates the guy. He attacks Angelica, but Rick shocks everyone by stepping in and telling the guy to calm down. Just then Snape arrives and stops a dragon man named Geese. Snape tells Geese to save it for the tournament, so Geese leaves. Snape apologizes to the bar owner and explains that Geese is his brother. There is no one strong enough to beat him, so he is troublesome to deal with when he gets violent. Snape checks on Angelica, and he is glad to hear that she is not hurt. Snape leaves, so Angelica explains the connection between herself, Snape, and the tournament. Snape promised to give her family a very large amount of money, but her investigation found that Snape's company doesn't have nearly enough to pay. This made her realize that Snape intends to earn money through the tournament. Rick uses his brain to determine that Snape is going to use the sponsor slot to fix the outcome of the tournament, and Angelica confirms it. Because of this, Angelica decided to win the tournament, so Snape couldn't uphold his end of the deal, and the engagement would be cancelled. The problem is that Snape used his sponsor slot on Geese, and Angelica knows that she can't beat him. Angelica is stunned when Rick offers to train her, and Angelica begins to fear for her own life. Rick says that this training will be harsher than anything Angelica can even imagine, but she tells them not to hold back. Angelica is shocked when Rick puts some weights on her. Rick just tells her to remember her strengthening magic, so she doesn't end up dying, but Angelica wishes he would explain the training to her first. Rick ignores Angelica's pleas and just drags her along as he runs. Angelica freaks out as she has no idea what's going on, so Rick explains that she can get her body used to fast movement, but getting pulled by someone faster. Angelica has some really good acceleration, but her problem is that she loses her stability after that. Angelica begs Rick to stop for a moment, but Rick declares that the key to rapid improvement is to kick it up a notch when you think you are at your limit. Rick assures Angelica that it won't be so bad because there are only 6 more hours left of this. When it is over, Angelica can't believe that her legs are still attached to her body because she thought they fell off a long time ago. Rick went through the same training, and he even died 3 times on his first day. Angelica is proud to have survived, but Rick reveals that they still have afternoon training coming up after a short lunch break. Angelica begs for it to be over, but Rick seems to ignore it, as Rick just says that they will meet again in an hour. After 5 more days of training, Angelica convinces herself that she didn't run away from training, and she just made a tactical retreat to protect her mental health. Angelica is confident that Rick won't find her, but she is very wrong. Rick looked for her all over the country, but Angelica was shocked because it had only been 15 minutes since she ran away. Rick surprisingly understands why Angelica ran away, because he did the same thing during his 2 years of training. Rick ran away dozens of times, but he also died tens of thousands of times. One time Alyssarette even had to share her mana with Brufston, so he could revive Rick another 2,000 times. This meant a lot more training and dying, so Rick had to get used to it. Rick was on the verge of giving up several times, but Brufston always gave him words of encouragement. Brufston told Rick to compare the regret he would feel if he gave up versus his current suffering. The weight of giving up was always heavier, so Rick kept going. Then Angelica describes all the things she hates about being a noble. Because of all those things, Angelica decided to contribute to her family as someone who fights, and not a noble lady. This is why Angelica dreams of becoming the first special class woman knight. Angelica doesn't want to feel the weight of regret either, so she is once again ready to train. Angelica is better suited to using a sword, but the tournament doesn't allow weapons. Because of this, Rick thinks it would be best to teach Angelica techniques that turn her hands into a sword. To do this, Rick has invited Rionette to join their training. A while later, it's time for the last match between the top spots of Block C. This is Angelica's fight, but she is growling like a wild monster for some reason. The audience knows that Angelica's elegant fighting style won't work against this specific opponent, but there is something different about her. The fight begins, and everyone is shocked to see her attack, and Angelica instantly wins. Rick is pleased with the results of the training, but Angelica seems to be in some sort of trance. Afterwards, Mizet returns after following a lead about one of the other orbs. Unfortunately, it led to nothing. Then Mizet tries to get along with the waitress, but he gets rejected. That night, Brufston explains to Mizet that they will get another orb if they win the tournament. Alyssarette wants to join the tournament as well, but Rick fears that she will destroy the entire place if she does. Rick says that he is training Angelica, but Angelica is disappointed because there isn't enough time for her to train more. Everyone encourages Angelica, and they point out that even a little training will help drastically. Alyssarette has no clue what they're talking about, but she still tells everyone to do their best. After everyone gives their words of encouragement, Angelica is ready to give her all. The next day, the Fist King tournament begins. The first matches are announced, and we get a look at who Rick, Angelica, and Geese are fighting. Rick is just glad that he doesn't have to face Brufston, because if he did, then he would just give up. Brufston's opponent is some fish-looking guy, and Brufston's helper cheers him on. Kelvin is there as well, but someone in the audience is worried about his condition. Gym Leader isn't worried, because he is sure that Kelvin will win, no matter what condition he is in. The audience begins to make bets on who will win, but Angelica has noticed something. Geese was placed in the bracket in a spot where he won't have to face Brufston or Kelvin until the final. The match fixing has already begun, because Geese will be able to avoid tough opponents. It is clear to Angelica that they are going to make Geese look super strong to the crowd, and when the odds against them are high, Snape will bet on his opponent. Then Geese will throw the match and lose, so Snape can obtain a grand fortune. Angelica will meet him in the second round, so she is determined to ruin their plan. A little later, Kelvin says that he is happy to see Brufston and Rick at the tournament. Brufston reminds him that they are here for the belt, and they all look forward to facing each other. Gym Leader points out that Kelvin has the look of a challenger now, and he is glad because it reminds him of how Kelvin looked a long time ago. Gym Leader was talking about when he first brought Kelvin to his gym, and the Gym Leader boasted about having a fighter from his gym reach the top 4 in the tournament. Kelvin was allowed to fight this guy, and Kelvin wondered if he was also allowed to end his life. That is of course against the rules, just like using a weapon, but those are the only rules. Kelvin confidently told the guy not to get upset after losing, but Kelvin ended up being the one on the ground. Kelvin lost, but his extremely high potential was obvious, even though he had never been trained before. Kelvin changed after his first defeat, as Kelvin trained harder, so he could grasp victory. Kelvin began looking forward to losing to even stronger opponents, because he would then just train even more. This was the life Kelvin always wanted, and his endless training led to him shocking the world. Kelvin ended up decimating the champion in his first tournament. It's been 6 years since then, but Gym Leader is glad to see Kelvin's spirit burning once again. Soon the first match of the tournament begins, but Geese's opponent isn't able to do anything to him. The opponent demands that he take the fight seriously, but Geese just shocks everyone with the amount of power he can generate with a single swing. The opponent doesn't give up, and launches a barrage of attacks at an insane speed, but Geese just becomes more annoyed. Geese attacks again, but he unintentionally hits the guy, and knocks him out cold. Geese is announced as the winner, and everyone wonders if there has ever been a sponsor fighter this strong. It is clear that Geese is very strong, but Rick thinks something is strange. Even with all of Geese's power and toughness, his movements are of a complete amateur. Unfortunately, Geese still won easily, and he left quite the impression on the crowd. The tournament continues, and our heroes win all their fights. The last match of the first round is Kelvin's, and our heroes are eager to finally see what he can do. Kelvin attacks with incredible speed, and Rick says that it's like Kelvin knew exactly what his opponent was going to do. Brufston explains just how crazy Kelvin is, as Kelvin can sense changes in electrical signals and adrenaline, among other things, just by smelling them. They agree that Kelvin is an incredible fighter, but the crowd is shocked as Kelvin gets knocked to the ground. Then Rick is the one to be shocked, as the others explain that Kelvin let himself get hit. The crowd cheers for Kelvin, so he gets up and quickly knocks out his opponent. Kelvin is announced as the winner, but his friends think he plays around too much. The second round begins the next day, and Snape arrives to take a seat next to Rick. Snape introduces himself to the others, but Alysseret wonders why the lizard is putting on a nice guy act. Rick wonders why Snape isn't sitting in the VIP seats, so Snape explains that this next fight is incredibly important. It's a fight between his brother and his fiancée, so he needs to see it up close. In the halls, Geese thinks about how he drank too much the night before, and Geese runs into Angelica. Geese has been reminded about who she is, and Geese says that Snape told him not to damage her face, so she can look good at their wedding. Angelica is eager to show him the results of her hard work, but Geese mocks her, and says that no amount of training could make up for the gap in their power. Angelica is sure that he has trained hard as well because of his physique, but Geese says that he doesn't do any training. Geese lives his normal life, and his body ends up this way. Geese calls himself a naturally boring talent, and he recommends that Angelica just stand still during their fight. That way he can make sure that he doesn't punch her stomach, so she can still bear Snape's children. This of course infuriates Angelica, so Angelica vows to destroy him. Their match begins as the crowd goes crazy, but Angelica is stunned when her first attack does nothing to Geese. Angelica manages to dodge his attack, but once again her attack does nothing to Geese, despite landing a direct hit. Angelica knew she wouldn't be able to hurt Geese with her basic attacks, so she does something that surprises Snape, all the way up in the stands. Angelica removed her strengthening magic, so Geese wondered what she was planning to do. Rionette cheers her on, and Angelica uses mana reflex inversion. Geese tells her to just give up, but Angelica uses her new thread slicer attack, and she manages to cut Geese. Everyone cheers her on, and Angelica wonders who Geese calls a small fry. Snape is stunned because not even the sharpest sword could scratch Geese's skin. Rick and Rionette know better, because this is what they taught Angelica. A look back we see when Rionette demonstrated the technique to Angelica. It is called Thread Slash, but Angelica thought that Rick was a psycho for wanting her to learn it. Rionette explained that it was not impossible, since Rick was able to learn it. Rick could never manage to be as precise as Rionette, so Rionette explained that Angelica just needed to feel the wind when she swung her arm. Angelica had a hard time grasping it, but Angelica practiced more than she ever had. Angelica eventually learned to incorporate her other abilities and reimagined the technique in her style. It is a technique that releases magical energy stored within the body in a short and powerful burst. It takes a huge toll on the body, but the hellish training they put her through makes it seem like nothing to her. Angelica's flicker feed ability allows her to use the technique in a way that only she is capable of. Geese gets annoyed when Angelica uses it again, and he nearly chops her in half. Snape is entertained as the two continue to battle it out, but Geese is done holding back. Geese sends Angelica flying into a wall and tells Snape that he can't resist doing whatever he wants to such a lively opponent. Angelica refuses to give up, but Geese has already seen Angelica's flicker ability a bunch of times and he can now match her speed. Geese hits Angelica hard this time and mocks her for being mediocre trash. Rick becomes concerned for Angelica, but Snape is glad that he is finally realizing that Geese's strength is unmeasurable. Snape first met his adopted brother when Geese was 8 years old, and Geese beat Snape so badly that he couldn't even stand. It turns out that Geese is the person that made Snape retire from fighting. Geese is a perfect prodigy, born with every talent needed for combat. Geese is a true monster. Geese is also a real jerk, because he continues to taunt Angelica. Geese says that Angelica is worthless trash and that will never change no matter how much training she does. Geese also insults Angelica's parents. Snape knows that Angelica thinks he is trying to rig the match and have Geese lose, but Geese is crazy strong and there is no need for that. Instead, Snape has done the opposite. The odds of a sponsor slot competitor winning are extremely low. Everyone bet against Geese, so Snape took those odds and placed a large bet on Geese to win. Then the crowd watches in horror as Geese begins to beat up Angelica. It's a cruel beating, and Rick determines that Angelica has reached her limit. Angelica is confident that Geese won't be able to beat her, but Geese is determined to see her break. Geese wants to make Angelica realize that a piece of trash will never be able to train enough to beat a prodigy like him. Angelica doesn't want to regret anything as she talked to Rick about, and she tries one last punch. This doesn't work out too well, as it just makes Geese eliminate Angelica even more. Rick tries to stop the match, but it's too late as Geese begins his final attack. Luckily for Angelica, something makes Geese miss. Angelica's life is spared and Geese is announced as the winner. Geese sees that Rick was the one who tossed his shoe, and Rick is furious. Angelica is taken away, and Rick meets with Geese in a hallway. Geese is pretty upset about the interference, but he is surprised when Rick avoids his attack. Rick calmly explains that there is no need to hurry, because he wants to defeat Geese in front of the entire crowd. Geese is furious, but he feels the same way. Rick goes on to win his next match, but Angelica is still in bad shape. Rick thinks about how hard Angelica trained, and he can't help but sympathize with her. Bruston defeats his opponent with just one strike as Rick did, and Kelvin shows off his immense power as well. This only leaves 4 competitors, and the semi-finals will take place the next day. Rick finishes up some training, and finds that Angelica has recovered. Rick assumes that Bruston healed her, but he warns that any damage deep in the body will remain. Something is very obviously bothering Angelica, but Rick doesn't even notice, so she explains what is wrong. Rick trained her even though there was nothing in it for him, but she ended up failing. Angelica apologizes for wasting his time, and explains that she just wanted to prove that she could walk on her own 2 feet. Angelica convinces herself that marrying Snape won't be so bad, but Rick snaps her out of it. Rick says that he is the one that should be apologizing, because he wasn't able to measure Geese's true strength before it was too late. Rick simply tells her to watch his next match closely, so Angelica can see what lies beyond the training she went through. The semifinals finally begin, and Rick is set to face Geese. Rick is surprised to hear that Geese wants to apologize to Angelica, but it turns out that Geese is only sorry that he didn't end her life. Now Angelica has to endure living while being tormented by her lack of ability. The fight begins, so Geese starts taunting Rick, but Rick ends up crushing his face. Rick has brought the prodigy to his knees, so Rick tells Geese to stop looking so pathetic. Geese thinks Rick is just getting too confident, but Rick rocks him again. Angelica is shocked to see Rick's attacks working on Geese's iron body, but Rick has hardly used his strength at all. Rick is only using controlled attacks. The force of the blow doesn't land on the outside of the body, it boards its way inside. It doesn't matter how strong Geese's body is, if Rick attacks with perfect timing, he will do major damage. Rick gives Geese a chance to quit, but Geese uses strengthening magic instead. It is specifically for dragons, and it makes the match much more intense. It uses up a lot of magical energy, but that is no problem for Geese. Snape explains that Geese has never trained his magical capacity at all. He was just born with a ton of it. Rick is practically the opposite, so Geese tells him to blame his parents. Rick's next attack gets stopped by Geese's iron body, and Angelica is shocked to see that Geese was able to learn the technique she was using. The crowd has gone quiet, so Geese assumes that everyone has gotten bored of watching a prodigy beat up an average person. However, Bruston sees it differently. Bruston explains that Rick doesn't care about the audience, he only cares about how Angelica sees him. Rick blocks another attack, and he is pleased to see that Geese is finally showing some signs of fatigue. Geese is shocked because no matter how much he attacks, Rick never sheds a drop of blood. This is because Rick is using a special technique. It allows Rick to disperse attacks within his body, so he has hardly taken any damage at all. Geese is insulted because Rick is holding back. Rick explains that he restricted his physical abilities to match Angelica's levels, because winning this match isn't the only important thing. Rick also wants to show Angelica her potential. Rick has turned this match into sort of a virtual rematch between Geese and Angelica. This of course infuriates Geese, but Rick tells him to calm down and think about his next attack. Geese turns his body into iron for his next attack, but Rick shatters his armor to pieces. Rick explains that Geese has never tried hard enough at anything, so getting this tired is new to him. Snape refuses to believe that Rick surpasses Geese's power, but Rick's member points out that Rick hardly has any ability at all. Rick started training after the time for training his magic reserves had passed, so technically, Rick is less than average. Snape can't understand how Rick can surpass a prodigy like Geese, but Angelica has come to realize why. Rick tells Geese that he isn't used to being tired, so Geese is no longer able to retain his precision while attacking. Those who work hard continue to push themselves even through fatigue. They keep moving until they can't anymore. The strength a person has after they have exhausted themselves is the person's true strength. Geese tries to keep attacking, but it's no use. Rick says that true prodigies hone their skills by putting in a lot of effort, and he has seen this happen with his friends. Geese has always thought he was the strongest person alive, but in reality, Geese was only running into opponents he could beat. Geese loses it after hearing this, so he uses the greatest of dragonoid strengthening magic. This practically turns Geese into a dragon, and Snape reveals that Geese has called on the ancient blood of the dragons. Rick is cut off guard by his power, and he is shocked when his next punch does nothing to the Geese. It's like Geese is made of metal, and his attacks are a lot faster. Geese lucked up being born with this powerful body, so Rick determined that he wouldn't be able to win. Geese is glad that Rick has come to his senses, but what Rick meant was that someone at Angelica's current level can't beat a dragon. This doesn't mean that Angelica should give up, because she just needs to keep training for the next time, and needs to put her life on the line. Then Rick starts adding a few months of training here and there, slowly increasing his power. Rick releases 12 months worth of training, and he becomes too fast to see. Angelica says that she isn't at this level yet, but she can see that Rick is using her flickering feet technique in an advanced way. This makes Angelica realize that this will be her strength if she continues the hellish training for another year. Rick has taken control of the fight, so he does some more lecturing. Rick explains that ordinary hard work can't overcome the difference in inborn abilities. It requires the madness to continue to exert extraordinary efforts. Angelica indeed lost after training herself to death for an entire month. So Rick questions if Angelica will be able to push herself to do that same hellish training for an entire year, if it means she can win. Angelica reminds herself about what Rick said about the regret scale. Angelica is inspired and declares that she was born with a scale that only ever tips in one direction. Rick knocks Geese on his back, and Rick wonders if Geese has what it takes to push himself through this current struggle. Unfortunately, Geese hasn't learned a single thing, so Rick decides that he will just have to end the fight. Rick uses the thread slash, but he isn't as precise as Angelica. The attack still manages to defeat Geese, but Rick tells him that Geese is lucky that he isn't facing the Angelica that will exist in a year. Rick and Angelica smile at each other, and Rick announces the winner. So now what will happen next? Subscribe to our channel to find out what will happen next. So friends, if you liked our recap video, then please like and share this video and do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.